Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Really good to see you again. Now, somebody just left me a message saying, hey, help, my color grading sucks. And hey, it's a difficult thing to do at first. So what I've decided to do is grab my RX100 Mark V here, pop outside, get some shots taken in S-Log in various lighting conditions, and bring them back in here and show you the steps I go through to color grade my footage. It's real easy, real simple, and once you get your head around it, you'll wonder why it was always so difficult. Stick around and we'll have a look at that. Okay, so I've popped out and I've taken 7 shots with my RX100 Mark V here, and I've pulled them into Final Cut Pro and let them do all of their bits and pieces so they're ready to color correct, and I'm just going to drop them here onto a timeline. Right, there's all 7 clips just in a row. They're different lengths. Now I only really need 1 frame out of each to do this with, so I'm just going to shorten them down for expediency. And I'll just expand that a bit. Now I'll just run you quickly through these clips. Now I've shot them in log 2, S-Log 2, and as you can see they're pretty flat, dull images. The lighting outside's nothing particularly amazing. It's actually quite an overcast sky and a fair bit of cloud and smoke, but so the colour of the sky is a bit weird at the moment as well. So I'm just going to quickly start through these, pick them out one at a time, and just do a basic grade on and show you how I do it, and also a couple of tricks for speeding your grading up. So I'll go for the first one here. Now this is a red clay pot with yellow paint on it, a wooden deck, and a grey concrete block behind it. There's pretty just stuff that was lying around on my deck, to be honest, in a pine cone here. Now it's a fairly flat image, so what I'm going to do is just go straight into the color correction here, and first thing I'm going to do is pick exposure. Now you'll notice up on the left hand side here I've got my vector scope, RGB overlay and lumograph in here, so I can see whereabouts in this picture all the levels are. So the blacks are pushed right up to about 12-15% there, and the highlights are right down at about 50%. 50%'s kind of what I expect there. It's quite a dull day outside, but I want to brighten this up and give it a bit more of a summery feel. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the blacks down, and you can see when I pull this down that in the lumograph the blacks are coming down more towards that 0 line, and then I'm going to bring my mid-tones up, and that stretches the whole lot out, and as you can see what that's doing is actually increasing the dynamic range of the whole picture. Bring the blacks down a little bit more. I want to make sure that none of them crush. When we talk about crushing blacks, that's when you're taking anything that's like 0 to 10% black and pulling it all down to the 0 black, so it's just a flat black. There's no texture left in there, and that's one of the key things to keep in mind when you're doing this sort of thing, is retaining texture. I'm going to bring the highlights up a little bit now that I've got that mid-tone up a bit, and then I'm just going to adjust it around until I can see that there's a bit more texture in here. So we're going to come back and fiddle this a bit later on. You don't want to over brighten it because that blows out whites, as you can see when you go up like that. I just want to keep it fairly moderate there. It's still a very flat image because there's not much color data in there at the moment. Okay, now I'm going to pop along to the saturation tool, and I'm just going to have a bit of a play here by taking the saturation right down to nothing, just so that it's just for me, so I can visually see how much I've got in here and what colors are popping up as it comes up, and then I'll take it all the way up the top and see how extreme it can get. Okay, that's quite bright. The yellow and the greeny yellow paint on it's not looking too bad, but the red gets a bit heavy in there, so I'm going to bring that saturation down to about 75%. Now, where I want to bring the colour up is in the mid-tones here, I think. Mid-tones and highlights. So I'm going to bring up the saturation here a bit in the mid-tones, and I'm going to bring it up again in the highlights. You can just see coming up around here that it's starting to bring a little bit of colour into the highlights and brightening up that yellow a little bit. The mid-tones coming down a little bit will just stop that red from over popping. So if I take it too high, you can see it just pops out too much, but if I bring it down to about here, it keeps it a fairly nice mellow red. The next thing I can do is I can come into the color board. Now this is where you would perhaps tint it, or change the actual color rather than just increasing and decreasing color and contrast. If I grab the master color tool here, you'll see that what I can do is I can bring that right up, and I can just go massively overboard and colorize things all over the place. And it's quite interesting just to move that around a little bit and see what happens sometimes, and then reset it back to 0. And I'm looking at that, and I'm feeling that some of it's a little bit greeny, I think, in the highlights. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring the highlights over, and I'm just going to drop a tad of green out of there. Dropping green and adding blue and red are kind of feel the same sort of thing. I can just bring the mid-tones over and drop that down a little bit. This takes a little bit of experimenting with to learn how to get it to where you want to. Partly to correct the colour and make it natural, but also you can tone the colour and make something feel a little bit warmer or a bit cooler. If you want to sort of go to an evening shot, you could cool something down and then play with the exposure and flatten it out a little bit as well. Typical what they call a day for night shot. So I'm just going to reset that again, that one there, and I'm just going to drop a little bit of blue out of the shadows and out of the highlights, but not so much out of the mid-tones, because the mid-tones sort of give me that concrete block and that black strap. That one there is starting to look pretty good to me. Now that I've got all that back in there, I'll come back to the exposure, and I'm just going to sort of play with it now and use this to get a bit more of a feel for what I want. I'm going to look at my graph here again and just keep an eye on it and look to see where it's peaking out. You don't have to have it all the way from 0 to highlights. If it's a darker image like this, naturally darker image, it's fine to keep the highlights down under 70%. So if I bring the highlights all the way up to 80 to 100% here, I can do that there. You can just see it looks completely washed out. That's not right. So I'm just going to keep that fairly well down, and my aim here is just to keep the dynamic range of the whole thing looking fairly realistic. So I think that's pretty cool. That's a good basic grade. Here I'll just swap you back to what we had before. We started with that, and I've brought it up to that. So there you go. There's a basic grade and a few easy steps. I'll just jump onto the next one here now, and I'll do the same sort of thing. I'll just run through it a bit quicker. So I'm just going to bring the blacks down, I'll bring the mid-tones up a bit, and I'll bring the highlights up a bit, just to give myself some good contrast without blowing it out. And there we go. I'm going to come and saturate it up a little. What have we got here? We don't want to go too yellow on that. It's actually a greeny yellow spray can. I'll take it to about there. I'll bring the mid-tones up a little more, and I don't want to make the grass too lurid either. That's actually a moss, and it's more of a brownie in there. So that's cool. And here I want to, I think, maybe put a little bit of red into the highlights just a fraction. You don't want to put too much in, or otherwise you start going weird ass like this. Just a little bit of red into there just to brown up the moss a little bit. And in the mid-tones, just take a touch of blue out. As you can see, the numbers I tend to use are very, very small, and you can also come in here and just adjust the numbers directly. So there you go for that one. And once again I come back and just touch the exposure a little bit more, just to make sure I'm getting the right depth out of this that I feel I should be. If I run up the highlights, make it a little bit daytime-ish, and just bring those blacks down so they're just on that 0, without losing this little bit of texture here in the side of the rubber mat. Just got to be careful there. If I bring that up there, you can see there's a bit of texture in there. If I crush it right down, it just looks wrong. But if I just get that nice point where the graph over on the left hand side is just touching on the 0%, that's going to be pretty cool. There you go. So once again, I'll just turn that off so you can see what we started with, turn it back on and see where we finished. Nice basic grade once again. Now there's another thing you can do in Final Cut, and while I am doing this in Final Cut, I'm assuming you can do similar sort of things to this in other NLEs, so don't worry about the particular software I'm using. You can do this somewhere else. There'll be similar functions. You might just have to look through the menus and find them. I'm just going to go copy on that image, and then I'm going to come to the next one here. I shot it with the same camera settings. It's only a couple of meters away from the previous shot, so the lighting conditions are roughly the same. So I'm just going to go Shift Command Paste on the Mac, because that lets me choose to paste properties. So in the case of this one here, there's only one property I've modified, which is the color board. So I'm just going to paste the color board, and we can see what that's done here straight away. So just by taking the color grade from one clip to another, I go from that to that. That means it gives me a bit of a starting point to work on. Now I'm pointing up at the sky rather than across a bit of moss on the ground here, so obviously my exposure is going to be a little bit different here, and I'm just going to fiddle that around a little bit. I've got some highlights up in the sky there that is just flat anyway. There's not much I can do about that one. And let me have a look here at the mid-tones, take the highlights back up a little, just messing around with it. Sometimes you just want to have a look and put it back, have a look and put it back, and just see where it moves to. Okay, that's looking pretty good, but the saturation is going to possibly need to go up a bit more in this one here, solely because it was looking upwards at a fairly bright sky. And I'm just going to give it a tad more in there and there, and take a little bit out of the shadows just so that it's not over popping everywhere. In this one here, I'm going to reset the color, and let me just have a look at it. Do I want to put a little bit more, take a little bit of blue out of the mid-tones, and perhaps I'm not sure where to do this. I don't want to add blue into the highlights because that will freak out the sky, but maybe I could take the blue out of the put a little bit of blue back into the mid-tones to bring up the flowers, and then I can take blue out of the highlights a little bit, out of the shadows, sorry, a little bit. Yep, that looks alright there. And maybe take some blue out of the highlights as well, meaning that the blue is just being accelerated a little in the mid-tones without trying to colour anything else. If you're unsure and it's not quite working, just come in here manually again and just take a couple of points out. There we go. Exposure once again, bit of a tricky shot this one. I'm just going to up the mid-tones a little bit and drop the shadows again, just to give myself a bit more contrast in here. There you go, and that's not too bad. I mean, it's not like taking flowers on a huge bright sunny day. I just turn that off again so you can see we started there and we ended up there. That's actually pretty realistic looking considering what I've got out the back. This one here is a bicycle. I'm just going to go and copy the first one because that's in a similar physical area to where the bicycle is there. Okay, and I'll just go shift command paste again so that I can paste that first color board into there, and that's actually looking pretty spot on straight away. I'm not sure what I might want to change in there. Just have a little bit of a look at the exposure levels. Just I might want to bring up a little bit more of the background up in the top left corner of the picture, and then drop down the mids maybe, or the other way around, bring up the mids and drop the shadows. Just experiment around with these things and see what happens. The green is a little lurid in there, so what I might do is just drop the saturation down a bit, and yeah, that just stops that blue from over popping, and doesn't make the rust and the greenery in the background quite so fluorescent. Though I might bring up the shadows a little bit just to put a bit of colour back up into here, because I know that that's all greenery in there, it's not just pitch black. And then what have we got here? Just going to drop the colour palette out, though that actually was pretty good there. I think I might actually just leave that as it is, same as the first one, it's in the same area, and just mess around a little bit here. So just swirling these palettes around a little bit can be quite interesting. You very seldom need to go more than about 3 or 4 points either side of the colour bar, but that's quite nice just there. So I'm going to leave that there. So there's where we started, there's the end, and I'll get on to the next one. I'm just going to do this one here from scratch because I can, and come back to the exposure once again. It's quite a different image, this one. I've taken it in the garden. I want to bring the shadows back down so that the lowest of them is just hitting the bottom. I'll bring the highlights up a bit so that they're not blowing out, but there's a reasonable amount of contrast in there. And then I can just mess around with this one, and I'm actually going to leave the highlights up a bit. If you leave the highlights quite high and then bring the mid-tones down, you can get quite a sunny image out of it. Without, you don't want to flatten it too much, you don't want to get too much in the deep. That's actually quite cool, and it actually looks a lot brighter than the real picture was. And then I can come into saturation again. I'm just going to saturate up the mid-tones in this one. I'm not going to worry about the highlights. I want to leave them fairly flat so that I just get that white specular rather than a green. Or maybe not. You don't want to go too green on it. Maybe I will bring that up a tad. Feel free to change your mind on these things and just experiment around a little bit as well. And I'll drop the saturation because I'm bringing up the highlight. I'll drop the saturation in the shadows just so that down here it doesn't get too fluorescent-y. And I'm just going to grab the mid-tone here and just see if I want to add a little bit of blue or take it down a bit. If you put blue up, it sort of makes it feel a bit cooler, but it's a little bit more realistic. More of a sunny day or evening, and you bring it down a little bit if you want to warm it up and make it feel more friendly. In the case of this one, I'm going to go for the realism, I think, and it is a cool day, and I'm just going to put that up about there. And yeah, that's a nice grade. That's a different feel. There's nothing wrong or right about different grades like this, so I can bring that highlights down a little bit as well, just to take a bit of blue out of the highlights and put it up into here. If I want to go for a warm spring summery evening, I can go to there. That's a natural color choice. If I come up to here, that's fairly natural as well. That's actually pretty much the coloring that it looks like out there now. Well, yeah, it's still up, and so there you go. That's a perfectly fine grade. Once again, here's where we started, here's what I've got now. There's nothing wrong with that grade at all if it's the feel and the look that you want for the bit of footage you've got. Next one I've got here, I've got some rocks. I'm just going to borrow that same one again by copying it and then pasting the attributes into here. There we go, and I know that straight away, yeah, that's going to come up too blue because of these granite rocks and things in here, so the colouring on that is completely wrong, and probably the saturation levels as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring those down a wee bit. The exposure still looks pretty good in here actually. If I have a look at the graph over here, you see it's peaking up a little bit over 100, so I will drop those highlights down just so that I'm not blowing out any texture at the top, which is largely coming off this bit of white on the granite. And I will flatten the colour board out. That's possibly feeling a little bit too browny for me, so I'm just going to put a fraction of that into the blue. I'm going to take some blue out of the highlights, but I'm just going to leave a bit of blue in the mid-tones, just a little tiny bit. And yeah, that looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. I might bring up the mid-tones a little bit and drop the shadows down. So it's quite deep in the shadows, this one here. There's a lot of natural darker tone because of the shadowing in the rock and along the edge of the decking there. And yeah, that's looking pretty good. Maybe I can put a little bit more mid-tone saturation in it to pop up the leaves a little bit and the ivy and stuff around. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. I like that one. So that's what we started with. That's where I'm ending up with. I could probably work on this one a fair bit more and just get some more out of it like that. I could spend ages on here. I wouldn't actually perfect anything, but I could come up with a whole heap of different looks that I might prefer for it. Once again, none of them particularly right or wrong, but yeah, just different. Don't want to come too lurid in the green. And yeah, as you can see, started there, got to here, quick grade. That's all we're after at the moment. And the last one here, I've got this dandelion sitting out the back. It was between the shed and the fence, so it's kind of squished colour wise, and very, very flat light. So once again, I'll just go from scratch on that one and make it real quick. I want to bring down my shadows, but not too far. I'm going to shove up the I'm going to drop the mid-tone right down and shove the highlight up, because I want to try and pump that up a bit more there. I want to pump up the contrast and see if I can make it feel quite sunny, just to get something more out of that yellow. Then what I'm going to do here is I'll just bring the saturation up on the mid-tones. That's a bit too much on the grass at the front, so if I bring up the mid-tones and then I bring up the highlights and drop the shadows, then just thinking about the darker tones, I want to stay flatter. The highlights can go up a bit, and I just want to bring out that bit more yellow in there. And then what I'll do is I'll then grab the highlights here and I'll take blue out of the highlight end, and that will just bring the green up a bit. That's quite cool. It warms it up, lifts the green, lifts the red. That gives me some yellow. Yeah, I like that. And I can just lift the shadow up a little bit, which takes that fluorescence out of the grass in the background. Don't want to go too far, otherwise you start tinting the shadows blue. But yeah, just that balance between highlighting up the yellow and keeping the blues in the background. You can see here I've got the hydrangea flower at the back again as well, same sort of tone. And there you go, that's the 7th one. And went from there and went to there, turned it into a fairly bright sunny day. I can brighten it up a little bit probably by dropping that and bumping that a tad. How am I going to do that? Can I get away with it? Yeah, a little bit like that, just sort of makes it feel a little bit sunnier, I think. Kind of hard to tell whether that's really what you want to do, because you sometimes want to brighten it up without damaging contrast too much. And can I bring that one down? Oh yeah, that looks quite nice there, doesn't it? That looks quite good there. That lets me play around with it just a little bit more. There's always more you can experiment with and just make small changes. That's 7 quick color grades. Hope that sort of process of adjust the exposure, adjust the saturation, adjust the color, and then come back to the exposure a little bit to tidy it up, has really helped. In more complex color grading software, you would actually have a primary grade where you do the exposure, saturation, color, and then you would do a secondary grade over the top of that and layer them up separately and change the order that they have effect, because well, as I said, it can get rather complex. Anyway, I hope that has been useful to you. It's a bit of a long video, but we've seen a few different variations of color grading. This is a very, very basic color grading setup here. I've got much more complicated stuff here if I really wanted to use it, but this was just a quick one for beginners to see what the possibilities are. One of the main things to keep in mind is that there is no real right and wrong grade. It's just the feel for what it is that you're trying to achieve at the time. Obviously you don't want people's skin to go blue or things like that. I'll do another one of these at some stage on skin tone as well. That's a whole different kettle of fish, but for now that's your basics of color grading. I hope it's been useful. If you want to see more videos I've done like this, then you can just have a look at this one and this one here, and down here you can click to subscribe to make sure you don't miss any other videos that I've been making or that I'm going to make, and I will see you shortly.